So first off, what we talked about just a bit ago were labor market policies that might be impeding labor market fluidity and labor market growth in general, than employment and the ease with which people find jobs and things like that. But I think some of your other research says part of what's driving these labor market outcomes isn't really just labor market policies, it's policies much more broadly. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, and it's a hard thing to nail down. So let me give some kind of 10,000 foot level numbers.
20,000 if you want.
20,000 foot, just to try to see why this might be important. There's been an enormous expansion of just the overall federal regulatory apparatus in recent decades.
How many pages is that now?
Well, it's equivalent to like take 350 copies of the King James Bible and stack them up, okay? That's how long the federal regulatory code is. If you just tell a computer to read the entire federal regulatory code, you certainly couldn't do it yourself, and count up the number of instances where you see must, shall, cannot,
these are the commandments.
Required. Well, there's more than 1 million such commandments in the federal regulatory code. Now, those are just numbers to give you a sense of the scale. But when you think about it, on the ground, businesses have to abide by these regulations. They have to incur costs to figure out what they are and to try to abide by them, to comply with them.
For an incumbent, they maybe have a lot of that knowledge already. So
yeah,
it's
exactly.
Already, it's durable. It's
durable knowledge. So this does become effectively another type of entry barrier to new businesses. And I think it's probably an important factor behind that slowdown in young business activity
even though
that we talked about
out of
earlier.
those 1 million commandments, a lot of them may not apply to them. They don't know which ones don't apply to them. How do you learn all the things I need to do to comply with the regulations?
They don't know, and it's even a little worse than that. Sometimes nobody knows. It's a matter of discretion. The scale and the complexity of itself is a source of uncertainty for businesses. So,
okay.
And economic theory tells us that uncertainty can deter investment activity, including new business formation. So there are many dimensions to this.
So there's two things. One is it makes it more difficult for everybody, established and unestablished, but it disproportionately makes it more difficult for the unestablished businesses, the new businesses.
There's another piece of it, which is our tax code. That's another, I don't know exactly how many Bibles, dozens and more Bibles in terms of just writing out the federal tax code. That's also grown much more complicated and much more extensive in the last 30 years or so. And the tax code itself, if you think about it, is often used quite consciously as an instrument of regulatory control. So we have all these special tax breaks in the personal income tax system, in the business income tax system, designed to discourage or promote certain activities. You think of that as part of the overall complex regulatory landscape. And as you talked about before, it raises costs for everybody, but disproportionately so for actual and potential new businesses, which feeds back into the labor market through the channels we talked about before.
There's another impact when there's uncertainty about what these policies are going to be. And can you talk a little bit about that, your work on policy uncertainty?
Yeah, Gary and I, around 2010, we were looking at the world around us. We'd just gone through a major financial crisis. There was major new legislation to reform the healthcare system. There were crises in Europe, and it just seemed like there was an awful lot of uncertainty in the overall economic environment, and that not all of that uncertainty could be traced to deliberate policy decisions and policy directions.
That we didn't know what the policies were going to be.
We didn't know what exactly they'd be, and even when we knew what they'd be, they were so new or different, we didn't know what their effects would be. The last several years in the United States, in Europe as well, really are somewhat exceptional in the extent of policy-related uncertainty.
You're going to say, look, I have this hypothesis. Uncertainty about policy affects the economy. And I'll just lay out one of the ones we thought about. Well, I'm thinking about making an investment. Maybe it's a long-term investment, and how profitable that investment is going to be is going to depend on what policies are followed. If that uncertainty is going to get resolved a year from now, well, I probably want to wait. I probably don't want to put this irreversible investment in place until I got a better idea of what the world's going to look like. And that was our theory. So the first thing you did as an economist said, well, heck, I got to be able to measure this uncertainty. So you, Nick, and others went out and actually did the hard work of measuring uncertainty. And like most things in economics, it's not exactly like, measuring the speed of light or something like that. It's a little less precise than that, but nonetheless,
Right.
I think you guys did some creative things and you were actually able to show that policy uncertainty had changed both at various points in time as events happened, but kind of trended upward over this period of time.
That part of the overall thesis is no longer controversial.
Right, so we got the facts that say uncertainty's up. Right. We have an economic theory that says uncertainty should affect investment, and because investment's tied back to the labor market, should affect the labor market, and also tied to growth, it should affect growth. So it seems like the pieces are coming together to say policy uncertainty is playing some role here.
Right, and let's think of the fiscal cliff or the debt ceiling as kind of politically manufactured policy uncertainty shocks. And maybe you want to see the Affordable Care Act as another shock in that sense. The role of those as kind of causal agents.
So here, let's be clear. You're saying maybe the Affordable Care Act is going to be good for business. Maybe it's going to be bad for business. Let's just put that on the side. But if we're uncertain whether it's going to get passed or what form it's going to take.
Or whether the Supreme Court will throw out some piece of it.
Or maybe we know even how it's going to fully be implemented, but we really don't know how it's going to actually work on the ground because we've never seen it before. That's the uncertainty you're talking about, not whether the regulation is good or bad. Any drag by the regulation itself falls under our previous topic of maybe we have too much regulation and that's slowing us down. But this is like uncertainty about regulation has got a further drag.
And you just made the distinction very well, and also it hints at why empirically it's difficult to isolate these uncertainty effects, because they're typically tied up with these other effects that are happening at the same time. So it takes a lot of work and some imagination to try to figure out how you tease that apart, and that's still very much going on. And that's why I'm maybe hedging a little bit about what the magnitude of these effects are. There's pretty good evidence that it matters somewhat to the downside, and so other things equal, you want to have a more stable policy environment. Do I think it's the main driver of weak economic performance in the last several years? No. Do I think it's a contributing factor? Yes. It's not just whether we have these occasional episodes where the policy process itself manufactures one of these uncertainty shocks. It's also about how we design our institutions so that when they respond to other shocks, do they do it in a way that amplifies uncertainty or reduces it? And I think the clearest example of this in recent years on the macro scales, look what's been going on in Europe. They designed this monetary union without really laying the foundations institutionally in terms of an economic environment, in terms of a decision-making process to deal with major crises, or even maybe not even so major, the Greek debt crisis. Greece is a tiny part of Europe. And it caused an enormous amount of consternation and economic harm within the European system because it was taking place within the Eurozone that had been established. And to economists' credit, many of them, Martin Feldstein comes to mind, had warned in advance of the creation of the common currency in Europe that you really haven't laid the groundwork to make this work. And that's an example of an institutional environment that when a big or small shock came along, the institutional environment wasn't well equipped to respond, and we got all this uncertainty as a consequence.
And it hadn't even laid out what its response would be. I mean, even if there were 10 different possible responses, it might have been better to just throw a dart and choose one of them than to leave all 10 of them still on the table, which is where they are. Nobody knows what the heck they're going to do. And, that's kind of your point is, it's one thing to pick the best of the 10. Maybe second best of the 10 is better than just saying, well, I'll choose later, and which is kind of the problem you have.